Because this book means a lot to me. Because when Govind was first contemplating the idea of writing this book, he approached me. And we had a talk about Vivekananda. I had very much the same view, and I've expressed it in much briefer length in my book, Why I'm a Hindu. And I was particularly struck by the angle that Govind proposed to approach the subject with. So I encouraged him to write, and I must say he's such a talented writer, he shouldn't have needed the encouragement, but it seemed to have helped. He came back with a draft chapter, which I liked very much, and I suggested to him that he create an outline of what he intended to say in the book, and I would approach my own publishers, Aleph, to see whether they would be interested in commissioning this work. I'm delighted to say that all that worked out exactly as our first conversation might have led us to hope, because Govind not only approached Aleph, but Aleph, my publisher's David Davida, really is the doyen of Indian publishing today, in English in any case. David loved the idea. They worked closely together to produce the book that's now before us, and that Dr Meena Pillai has so beautifully described. I think she's absolutely right in her understanding of what Govind was trying to achieve, and I hope that all of you, when you look at what he has to say, will agree that it's a seminal contribution to our appreciation of one of the great but misunderstood figures of Indian recent history, as well as of Hindu thought and spirituality. Misunderstood not because of anything that he said or didn't say, but because of the way in which he has been appropriated by certain people for their own political ends. And I think what Govind has done is really rescue him from that appropriation, and we should talk about that when we sit down together. So once again, with renewed apologies, thank you for your patience, and we'll have a little conversation about this on stage. Thank you very much. I wanted to start with something so basic that I think Govind will not find it difficult to respond, which is the title of his book. As you know, he's called the book Vivekananda, the Philosopher of Freedom. And I'm going to ask him two questions about the subtitle, about the philosopher part and about the freedom part. So let me start first of all. What did you intend by this very carefully chosen subtitle, Govind? Why Vivekananda as a philosopher, which is not the term that most people would immediately associate with him?
One of the things that really surprised me when I started surveying the literature for this book, on literature on Vivekananda, was how less frequently he has been characterized as a philosopher. Given his dazzling intellectual brilliance, the fact that he is presenting Advaita in a completely modern idiom, like he's translating between two very old philosophical traditions, 2,000-year-old philosophical traditions on both sides. From the Indian philosophical tradition to the Western philosophical tradition as it existed in the 19th century. So this is an immense task, and all the more, I would compare it to the summit of what is traditionally considered the summit of philosophical achievement, creating a metaphysical system. I think it is an intellectual achievement comparable to it. But at least in the 4, maybe even 5 decades, I don't think there has been a well-known book that looks at Vivekananda purely as a philosopher. And that is something that got me wondering, why is it that we don't look at him as a thinker, as a philosopher? And I think one of the reasons, partly the reason, is that all of us first encounter Vivekananda as a moral and spiritual figure. And that's natural, because he was definitely that. But I think at some point we need to disengage with this image and focus more narrowly on Vivekananda, the thinker and philosopher. Because otherwise there is a danger that the intellectual originality of his thought would get overshadowed and lost under the aura of his spiritual greatness. So that is the reason that I chose the word philosopher.
Fair enough. Then the second question immediately follows. The philosopher of freedom. what would you say freedom meant to Vivekananda, and why did you juxtapose those two words in your subtitle?
So, Vivekananda is, having read him yourself so closely, you would realize what a multifaceted thinker he was. The range of his thought, ranging across history, politics, metaphysics, social issues, and in each of his domains, his thought is very multidimensional, very nuanced, very subtle, and one often thinks that there cannot be a unifying theme to such a vast repository of thought. But on reading Vivekananda again, what I see is the one thread that runs through all his concerns seem to be the idea of freedom. So, what is most central to him was, of course, the Hindu goal of mukti, moksha. But Vivekananda took this idea of mukti and he defined it. Traditionally it has been thought of as escaping the cycle of reincarnation, and mukti in that sense was the popular understanding. But Vivekananda took mukti to mean absolute freedom, freedom from any kind of limitation, freedom from our finite being. While there have been very philosophical treatments of mukti by Shankara, for instance, seeing it as freedom is, I think, an extraordinary innovation. And if one asks, how does Vivekananda's exposition of Advaita differ from traditional scholarship on Advaita? I think the difference is that the famous Brahman Atman identity, right, where you say Tattvamasi or Aham Brahmasmi, where your own inner self and the impersonal absolute reality of God is, you find that they are the same. Traditionally, Advaita focused on Brahman, but Vivekananda gave equal emphasis to the Atman side of the equation, and that also allowed him to talk about the individual human being. And for him, the individual human being was the site of access to the Atman, and hence the site of all truth and reality. So for him, behind the individual lay an unexpressed infinite potential. And I think that fitted well with the ethos of the age, because he was speaking in America and England at the turn of the century, when modernity is being prefigured. And as you all know, individualism is the central theme of modernity. So I think he was speaking to the times, and this concern with liberty runs through all his concerns, whether his call for social freedoms, his idea that one should use critical independent reasoning and not think according to any authority, his idea of the empowerment of the individual. Behind all this, I think his concern was freedom.
Absolutely. No, I think that's a convincing response. In the interest of time, I'm going to short-circuit some of the conversation, go straight to the issue that Meena Pillai has already raised, which is the question of what Vivekananda is represented as standing for. Now, in my own sort of short section on Vivekananda and why I'm a Hindu, I focused on his addresses in Chicago, particularly in 1893, because those addresses, it's a wonderful story of how he was initially invited to come and speak for 3 minutes. No one would invite somebody to come all the way from India to Chicago to speak for 3 minutes. But then he delivered that speech, that historic beginning, Dear Sisters and Brothers of America, which Meena echoed today. And what happened thereafter was a standing ovation and a request for him to come back and speak some more. And he ended up making 5 speeches. And one of the most interesting things about that was it was a brilliant evocation in English to an international audience that he rightly presumed knew nothing about Hinduism, of what he thought was the essence of the faith that he stood there to represent. And one of the key messages was when he said, that I stand here on behalf of a faith that has taught the world not just tolerance, but acceptance. When I read that as a teenager and those words stayed in my mind and went on and on, sort of churning in my head, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized how profound his insight was. Because I, did history classes in school where we learned that tolerance was a good thing. It's a virtue, right? So a tolerant king is a good guy because he allows other people to have beliefs different from his own. But the more you think about it, tolerance is actually a rather patronizing idea. Because a tolerant king is really saying, I have the truth, you are in error, but I will magnanimously indulge you in your right to be wrong. That's essentially all that tolerance is. But what Vivekananda was saying is we believe in acceptance, which means that we say, I believe I have the truth, you believe you have the truth, I will respect your truth, please respect my truth. Which struck me as a profoundly useful way of surviving in a society where the coexistence of religions was so indispensable. But it particularly came from his understanding of Hinduism as a faith in which the central belief was Ekam Sat Viprabahuda Vadanti. There is only one truth, but different wise sages call it by different names. He would love quoting the Shiva Mahimna Stotram, which says that as many different rivers flow, some straight, some crooked, in different directions down hills and valleys and end up in the same sea, so also all ways of worshipping the divine end up in the same Brahman, end up in the same place. And that idea was a profoundly revolutionary idea to Westerners, and it captured the imagination of many people in Chicago and went on, of course, to acquire adherents and eventually spawned other kinds of philosophical offshoots like the Theosophical Society. All sorts of things happened because of his spreading of this remarkable insight. I remember at one point in one of the addresses, he refers to God or Jehovah or Allah, and he goes to half a dozen different names, saying, by whichever name you know the same divine. Essentially, it's the same, to convey the idea that it's the same. The same Brahman, the same concept, the same divinity we're all reaching out to. And that idea, I think, was profoundly a Vivekananda contribution to understanding Hinduism. Whereas today we have a much more narrow-minded, and I would even argue bigoted understanding of Hinduism that has sought to appropriate Vivekananda and said essentially that he is their sort of symbol or embodiment of their virtues. But he is not, because they have taken the soaring majesty of Advaita Vedanta and of the philosophy that Govind has just described for us and reduced it to kind of the team identity of the British football hooligan who says, my team is the only one that's right. If you're supporting another team, I'm going to hit you on the head with my placard. I mean, that's basically how these guys behave. That's not what Hinduism is all about. That's certainly not what Vivekananda is all about. So I want to ask Govind specifically this aspect. To what extent do you react in the book to the, shall we say, the ownership of Vivekananda that has been taken by the Hindutva political doctrine? And how do you see the way in which Vivekananda related to other faiths, particularly those on the Indian subcontinent like Islam and Christianity?
That is, I think, a wonderful question, because it goes right to the heart of the book. Because though the book deals with several topics, including Vivekananda's thought, the salient theme of the book is the fundamental opposition between Vivekananda's thought and philosophy and the ideology of the Sangh Parivar. And today, when many of the right-thinking citizens have a growing and acute sense of worry, I think Dr Meena P expressed some of it, that all our public institutions in India is being slowly captured by Hindu majoritarianism. I think Vivekananda's thought is more important to us than ever. Because Vivekananda's thought and his ideas on religion, humanity and reason are a valuable resource to use against any kind of religious majoritarianism, but particularly so against Hindu majoritarianism, because he's speaking within the same tradition and he's using ideas and terms of reference that are Hindu. So, in today's India, um, what I would say is that in relation to Christianity and Islam, his views are the polar opposite of the Sangh Parivars. The warmth and the acceptance he gave to these religions. For Christianity, of course, Vivekananda had a deep personal devotion to Christ and to Virgin Mary. He used to pray to Virgin Mary, and he often prayed in churches. And he had, and towards Islam also, he had a very accepting attitude. And I think of all the things that in the theme of where I explore how the Sangh Parivar ideology is the antithesis of Vivekananda's thought. There are many aspects to it, and I devote several chapters to it. But perhaps the one that is most important to us today is exactly what Dr. Tharoor talked about, his relationship with Islam and Christianity. And in this context, one has to look at what is going on in the country. That in most parts of the country today, Muslims are being demonized in the public sphere, through social media, through hate speeches, and they are being persecuted. Many of them have become the victims of targeted violence. And there is also a very pernicious narrative that is being pushed on us. This has to do with India's history. So the claim is that India has been under 1,000 years of foreign slavery. So the objection is not only to the British rule, but to the Islamic rule, which starts with the first invasions in 10th century AD. And this narrative, I think, which is most ubiquitous on social media, but also finding expression in, I think, more intellectual forums, has it that that the Islamic conquest saw millions of Hindus being converted to Islam by force, that there was a genocide of Hindus, and that all the Islamic dynasties, including the Mughals, were basically despots who tyrannized over Hindu subjects. Now, anyone who is familiar with history, and that's history written by both Indians as well as people, mostly from the Western academia, would know this is grossly exaggerated and wild. But these people take they claim that they take Vivekananda for an inspiration. They call him their icon. And I think one should talk about what Vivekananda thought about these issues. Regarding conversion to Islam that happened over the centuries, addressing a rally in India, which consisted of, and Vivekananda's rallies were hugely attended. Several hundreds of people would gather. It was a mainly Hindu audience, and he says that the conversions to Islam, how they happened, what he says is, it would be madness to think that it was all the work of sword and fire. And he says, the Islamic conquest came as a salvation for the downtrodden and the poor of this country. And I think in the same speech he mentions this, that even to the Mohammedan rule, we owe that great blessing, the destruction of exclusive privilege, that is caste privilege. So what Vivekananda is taking note of here is that the majority of people who converted to Islam over the centuries were people from the bottom of the caste hierarchy. And they converted not because they were forced to or they were coerced, but because they wanted to escape the caste tyranny. They wanted to, the social system that Islam offered, Islamic society, was relatively more egalitarian and allowed for more upward social mobility. That was the reason for for them converting. And now Vivekananda also saw clearly that India had gone into a civilizational decline for over a millennia. And it is interesting to look at who he blames for it. He blames, of course, he did not like the British occupation. It was political slavery, and he knew that the British were looting the country. But what he says is that the British conquest and the Islamic conquest were only what he terms external factors, which was acting on an malaise that is already inside the system. He blames the Brahmins and Kshatriyas, the upper caste, and the tyranny they imposed on the lower caste as the reason for India's downfall. He says that the upper caste crushed out the lower caste people so much, sunk them into so much poverty and helplessness that the nation became weak. And this is the reason why India went into terminal decline as a society and a country. In fact, in one of his speeches, he says, do not take the root of the weak and blame others and throw mud at them. You are responsible for your own condition. Be brave and take up responsibility for that.
But as you know, Govind, one of the quotes of his that's very, very popular with the Hindutva lot is the famous call to Hindus to arise and awake and act and so on. Now, how do you interpret that? I mean, in some ways, my answer usually is that we have to understand what kind of Hinduism he wanted to arise and awake. It's not necessarily this version of Hinduism that some people are peddling, which is an intolerant one, but rather this capacious, inclusive Hinduism that he felt should awake. Is that a good enough answer, or do you have something more to add to that?
I think that is the main thing, but there is also a historical aspect to it, which I think has been missed in a lot of readings of Vivekananda. So I would have to say that the misreadings of Vivekananda comes not only from the right, but also from the left. There has been a section of the academia which I think generally inspired by what we could call postmodern theory, tries to read Vivekananda from concerns of identity. It could be gender, it could be caste, it could be religion. And they too have committed this mistake of historical anachronism, because Vivekananda was a colonized subject preaching religion to a colonizer. Like America may not have been an imperial power, but what was happening at that time was, in fact, what has been called an-globalization in the 1890s to around till the First World War. The whole world is connected, but through British colonialism and the ideas of the Anglo-Americans percolates through all these colonies through various channels. So there is this, and there is this. So what does, as Edward Said's thoughts show us, hegemonizing civilization does not just rule by power of arms. It does so by delegitimizing the civilization of the conquered, by delegitimizing their culture, their religion, their intellectual contributions. So, for example, it is not only with Hindus. The British tried to show that the Mughals were completely incompetent rulers, because they did not want Indians to have an idea that they were ever ruled capably, because it fitted in with their projection that they were the only ones who were capable of ruling India and providing efficiency. So it is in this context that Vivekananda wanted to provide a sense of confidence to Hindus in their religion, because it had been attacked so much by one for missionary activity, of which I cover a lot in the book. And it is only in that particular context that Vivekananda says that you should feel pride in your religion. And even then, however, there are several times he warns that confidence in your religion should not degenerate into a parochial fanaticism or the feeling that your religion is superior to others. I mean, he was far-sighted enough even then to warn of that danger.
Right. One more I'll just ask a couple more questions. I realize how late the evening is. It's important to just cover a few more aspects. One is that I was struck by the fact you talked about the way in which his universalism sort of tried to take Hinduism beyond the rituals, the caste system, the temples, mythology, and so on, through which the spiritual truths of Hinduism are expressed, and he came up with a more profound understanding. You remember he talked about and wrote about the 4 kinds of yogas: Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge; Bhakti Yoga, the yoga of worship; Karma Yoga, the yoga of service, which is why, as you know, he started the Ramakrishna mission; and finally Raja Yoga, the interior process of meditation and looking for the truth, seeking the truth within yourself. He's one of those rare sages who himself embodied the virtues of all 4 kinds. He was certainly a Jnana Yogi. He had read profoundly the spiritual texts of Hinduism. He was very much a person who understood, even if he didn't spend much time practicing bhakti. He was certainly a karma yogi. He traveled the length and breadth of the country. In fact, his famous march through India, armed with nothing more than a staff and a begging bowl, is the beginnings of this whole notion that today, a century later, is continuing. A century and a quarter later, is continuing with the Ramakrishna mission. And he was an exponent, a practitioner of Raja Yoga, on which he even wrote a book. So you've got someone who incarnates all of these things, and yet there was a 5th side to him, which had nothing to do with all of these, but was anchored very much, and Govind's already hinted this a bit, in rationalism. When he went on that walk through India, which ended up in Trivandrum and eventually Kanyakumari, he famously said, that I'm going through the country as a sannyasi, preaching my faith, but how much more useful it would be to my people mired in backwardness and ignorance if we sannyasis could march through the country teaching them science and mathematics. It's an extraordinary statement for a sannyasi to make. And another statement he made, which at that time was very controversial, today we'd find it pointless, was his open attack on child marriage. And in particular, the practice of, 8-year-old, 10-year-old girls being given away as brides to 60-year-old widowers. And he found that absolutely disgraceful and a blot on the faith. And he said, this has nothing to do with Hinduism, and I cannot accept this being sanctified in the name of my religion. So this kind of sort of modern, spirited rationalism that Vivekananda articulated seems to me something that we tend to overlook, in which we, in the ways in which we appreciate what he stood for. Now, going beyond his philosophy to his sort of social stance, as it were, would you anchor this as one more aspect of his faith and freedom? Would you go beyond that? Or how would you address this issue?
I think part of it is definitely his faith in freedom, because what he wanted, as he always said, this idea of man-making education has been widely misunderstood. It has been understood as trying to raise a kind of powerful masculine person. The word man was then only used, it was used in a non-gendered way to mean human, right? And here one really sees the contrast between the Sangh Parivar's idea of man-making education, where, if you read Golwalkar, for example, he talks about how one should train the young minds to imbibe the right sanskars. But for Vivekananda, the idea of education was that he said education can be done completely only on the negative side. You take away the barriers. The individual develops for themselves. And in one of his speeches, he says that, tells the audience that I would be sorry if you believed anything that I say. But I would be happy if I arouse in you a capacity for thinking on your own. And sometimes he said that the atheist is closer to God than the theist, most theists, because they just blindly believe in God. They are not yet born into the world of religion. The atheist is at least trying. He's trying to get answers. And so he is closer to God than theist. So while freedom is an aspect, however, I think reason is something about Vivekananda's intellectual makeup. It is a very critical component. And I think Vivekananda might be unique among the world's religious thinkers in claiming that, usually the claim is that reason and religion are not incompatible. That is what the religious people say when they're attacked that, science, religion is basically irrational. Vivekananda went beyond that. He said that religion has to meet the claims of reason every bit as much as science should. And his intellectual effort is to show that. And this critical reasoning that Vivekananda held to be so important is something that he applied not only in his chosen field of spirituality, but in relation to social issues, in relation to... And I think that is what is really fascinating about Vivekananda, that we have a thinker who is a sannyasi, but who doesn't see the world only to the lens of spirituality. He is interested in all domains of existence without reducing it to the spiritual, though he does say that everything is ultimately the expression of the spiritual. So he would see history, sociology, everything as separate components, and he tried most of all to analyze it by reason. So, for example, this is also kind of connects up with the question you asked about the appropriation of him, and the political project of Hindutva has a certain template when it comes to Hindu temples, and the Ram Janmabhoomi movement, the most famous of it, is predicated on the idea that there is the Rama who is mentioned in the Ramayana was a real historical character, that just as the mythology describes, he was a prince of Ayodhya, and that because he was there, this place is holy. And the fact that there is no historical or archaeological evidence for this does not matter. But for Vivekananda, who operated from reason, he would not agree with the premises of any of this. So, for example, he openly doubted the historicity of Krishna. I don't know whether he did of Rama, because he might have, but at many times he says that Krishna, the character of Krishna, is an amalgamation of various characters, a prince, a warrior, a shepherd, and he said there must have been some historical philosopher who became the nucleus of all this, and all these ideas was pinned onto him. And what is interesting is that, and he discusses the historicity of Krishna and Gita with his disciples before we have a record of that, and he starts the discussion with the historical evidence for the existence of any of these characters and incidents, like the Kurukshetra war, Arjuna, Krishna. And he said that, and interesting, this was when Indian archaeology has not really taken off, and Vivekananda could have maintained that, further evidence could be forthcoming. But what he did was he explored Sanskrit sources like the Saptadeva Brahmana, which are ancient sources, and said, for example, that there is the record of all the kings who performed the Ashwamedha, and Parikshit's name is recorded, but there is no record of Arjuna, no record of Yudhishthira, and they were supposed to have performed the Ashwamedha. And he goes on to say that there is no evidence to suppose the Kurukshetra war actually happened, or that Krishna existed as a historical figure. And in any case, mythology is not for him the source for historical evidence. But he also says none of this matters, because he thought that the strength of Hinduism was that his figures were not historical, because for him Hinduism was a religion of principles. Now, if you base a religion on a historical person, there's always the possibility that new historical evidence could, kind of change the equation, and it would affect your belief and faith. But he said our religion is based on principles. We have rishis, but we have no information about them. So it's a much stronger foundation.
I think that leads to my last question. I'm very, very apologetic about the late hour. And that question flows from what Govind has just said. I'm always reluctant to engage in the counterfactual simply because we're always speculating. When we try and imagine what somebody who passed away a century ago and more might have said or done today. But when you mention history, it's impossible to be unaware of or unconscious of the contestation over history that's taking place today. We've seen the demonization of Aurangzeb and Aurangzeb ke aulad and all that, and we've also seen some of the overt rejection, which you already alluded to, of all the Muslim rulers over the last 1,000 years. Even Akbar, whom Vivekananda, I think, described as the shadow of God on earth. He was a huge admirer of Akbar's. Even Akbar today is demonized by the very people who are exalting Vivekananda's their symbol. How do you think he would have reacted to the use or misuse of history for those purposes today? And what advice might he have given those in the what can I call them, the Hindutva of the Hindutva persuasion, when they try and exact their revenge upon history today?
I think, as I said, it's almost an impossible question to answer because one, you are speculating on someone who's no longer here.
I preface my question.
I know. So, but I'm just saying it's a bit difficult. Also, you're dealing with Vivekananda, such a complex personality and intellect that you don't know what he would say. But I would imagine that if he were to talk to people who profess the Hindutva ideology today and their use of history, he would first of all tell them that modern history is that go back to the basics of your religion, because what it teaches you is critical inquiry. And he would say, and then apply it to everything that you see. Because while it is true to say that Vivekananda emphasized reason, it is not as if that is something he brings anew to the Hindu philosophical tradition. Starting with, not only Vedanta, which starts with Shankara in 8th century AD, but schools of Sankhya, schools of yoga, all that preceded them, all of them use reason. They use Vedas as a basis, but it is a kind of a strategic move of exegesis. If Shankara's, the four means or pramanas of knowledge that Shankara gives, one of them is reason. And though he mentions the Vedas, and if you really take Shankara's system, it is very clear this is a tactical move because he has to convince the Hindus. Because the Brahman that he defines is so beyond thought that no scripture could give positive knowledge about Brahman. So I think what he would actually tell them is that reason is an integral part of this religion, and that you have to go back to the fundamentals of the religion, and what you're doing is to pervert it.
Absolutely right, and it's a great note on which to end. The great Hindu tradition of Shastrarth, of discussion, of argument, of coming to a conclusion through reason, is precisely where Govind situates Vivekananda, and his own book is a very, very interesting, as Meena said, very scholarly, very well researched, and very well argued defense of a particularly valuable point of view in today's hot contestations over Hinduism and over Hindutva. So congratulations, Govind, on your book. My best wishes for its success, and I urge you all to pick up a copy outside and read it. Thank you very much.
Govind should be the luckiest first writer in the world, because after his first book, getting interviewed by somebody like Shashi Tharoor, and what more you need? So it's such a long interview and such a long session, and it's been quite engaging, enlightening. And but I think for the democratic structure we are talking about, I think we should get some questions at least for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, the most. നമുക്കൊരു കുറച്ച് സമയം മാത്രമേ ഉള്ളൂ, പക്ഷേ വളരെ വിവാദപരമായ പല കാര്യങ്ങളുമാണ് ഇവിടെ പറഞ്ഞതെന്ന് എനിക്കറിയാം. പലരുടെയും മുഖത്തില്ലെങ്കിലും ഉള്ളിലെങ്കിലും ചില അഭിപ്രായ വ്യത്യാസങ്ങളുള്ള കാലമാണിത്. അതുകൊണ്ട് അത് ഞാൻ എല്ലാം വിശ്വസിക്കുന്നില്ല, എല്ലാവരും സന്തോഷമായിട്ടാണ് പോകുന്നത്. സോ ഇഫ് എനിബഡി ഫീൽസ് ലൈക്ക് ആസ്കിങ് എ ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻ ഓർ ചലഞ്ചിങ് സം ഓഫ് ദി പൊസിഷൻസ് ദാറ്റ് ഗോവിന്ദ് took or even Shashi took, shoot, this is democracy.
Dr. Palpu and his intervention in all these things. And in some places you have mentioned something called Irava revolution. I was asking a history professor today, have you seen this usage anywhere? We have seen it as social revolution, but you have used the term Irava revolution. Have you coined it that way, or have you found it elsewhere? Just curiosity.
No, it's something that I used. because I felt that it was a revolution that was led by the Iravas, and in this character is very much determined by what the Iravas did. And while it became and played a part in a larger social revolution, it is the beginning point and it deserves to be characterized as such.
Okay, which means it's your finding. Okay, anyway, let's hope people will accept it anyway.
I am from the family, but the kind of hatred that is generated now, do you think at some point Vivekananda's writings will be a target of attacks if it is true things are coming out?
I don't think his his writings itself will be, because you can always not read them and just make keep a book and not read it. But as an example that shows the state of the nation right now, a media influencer and a politician who I had, I should mention this, not Dr Tharoor, who I talked with about the book and was very interested in it, told me, you know what, you send me, say, 10 quotes of Vivekananda on these issues that have become very controversial, and I will tweet them. And then what happened is that, as a thread, and then what happened is that his social media team argued with me and said, no, you can't do this, because for sure you'll have a number of cases slapped against you, and it's not worth it for us. This battle of Vivekananda is not worth it for us to have this amount of cases. So if a politician and someone who is powerful compared to an ordinary man cannot even tweet what Vivekananda said, then I think it answers your question.
Send me the quotes, Govind.
I am Jagannivasan, artist. Swami Vivekananda Chitram Vivekananda Sri Padashalayil 50 വർഷം ശ്രീരാമകൃഷ്ണ ആശ്രമത്തിൽ പ്രദർശിപ്പിച്ചു. അവസാന സ്വാമിജിയാണ് അവിടെ വെച്ചത്. ഇപ്പോൾ റീടച്ച് ചെയ്ത് നമ്മെ നോക്കുന്നതായിട്ട് രചിച്ചിരിക്കുകയാണ്. സ്വാമി വിവേകാനന്ദ ഈസ് നോട്ട് എ ബോഡി ബട്ട് ആൾസോ എ മഹാത്മാവ്. മഹാത്മാവ് മീൻസ് എ ഗ്രേറ്റ് സോൾ. Swami Vivekananda living in my heart. Thank you very much.
6 o'clock onwards, but it was worth it, every minute, and thank you very much. Thank you, Shashi. Thank you, Govind, and all those who have come. Thank you very much. Meena. Meena and Gauri. Thank you.